The morning sun streamed through towering windows of the Preston family's three-story mansion in Boston's most exclusive neighborhood. The sound of a vacuum cleaner hummed steadily from downstairs as Michael Preston, though everyone called him Mike, scrolled through his phone, still wrapped in his $1,000 betting. At 17, Mike had everything a teenager could want. His room alone was bigger than some apartments, decorated with the latest gaming systems, a massive TV, and designer furniture that he barely noticed anymore. The walls were lined with trophies and medals, though most were from competitions his parents had paid for him to enter, rather than ones he'd earned through real effort. "Your breakfast is ready, Mr. Michael," called Dorothy Williams from the doorway. She stood there in her simple blue uniform, her gray hair neatly pulled back, hands clasped in front of her. Dorothy had been working for the Prestons since before Mike could remember. Every morning for the past 12 years, she'd wake up at 4 a.m., take 2 buses from her modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood, and arrive at the Preston house by 6 a.m. to start her day. "Whatever," Mike muttered without looking up from his phone. "Just leave it on the desk." Dorothy quietly placed the tray of perfectly prepared food on his desk, fresh fruit arranged just how he liked it, eggs cooked to his exact preference, and toast cut into precise triangles with the crusts removed. She'd learned all his preferences over the years, along with those of his parents. Not that any of them had ever asked about her preferences, or her life, or her family. The walls of Mike's room told the story of his privileged existence. Photos showed him on family vacations to exotic locations, skiing in the Swiss Alps, sailing in the Caribbean, safaris in Africa. But in none of these photos was he actually smiling. There was always that same bored, slightly annoyed expression, as if even these extraordinary experiences weren't enough to impress him. His mother, Elizabeth Preston, barely glanced up from her laptop as Dorothy brought her morning coffee. She was always busy with charity galas and social events, managing her image as a philanthropist while rarely interacting with the people she claimed to help. His father, Michael Preston, was rarely home, too occupied with running his investment firm and growing the family fortune to spend time with his son. "Dorothy," Elizabeth called out as the maid was leaving the room. "We're having the Andersons over for dinner tonight. Make sure everything is perfect. You remember what happened last time." Last time had been when Dorothy had used the wrong wine glasses for the red wine, a mistake that had led to Elizabeth berating her in front of the guests. But Dorothy had simply nodded and said, "Yes, Mom," like she always did. She never complained, never argued back, never showed anything but quiet dignity in the face of constant criticism and condescension. Mike watched this interaction with disinterest, too absorbed in his social media feed to notice the brief flash of hurt in Dorothy's eyes. He was used to Dorothy being around like furniture, present but not really worth paying attention to. He didn't know that she worked 2 other cleaning jobs on weekends to help support her family. He didn't know that she put both her children through college with her earnings, or that she took night classes herself to earn her business degree. The morning progressed like any other in the Preston household. Mike got ready for his private school, putting on his perfectly pressed uniform that Dorothy had laid out. He grabbed his designer backpack and headed downstairs, passing by Dorothy as she dusted the family photos in the hallway, photos that showed the Prestons at various social events, but never included the woman who had helped raise their son. Outside, Mike's brand new luxury car waited in the circular driveway. He'd gotten it for his birthday last month, even though he crashed his previous car through careless driving. As he climbed in, he barely registered Dorothy's quiet, "Have a good day at school, Mr. Michael." At school, Mike was surrounded by other wealthy teenagers who shared his privileged worldview. They sat at lunch discussing their latest purchases and upcoming vacations, mockingly watching the scholarship students who worked part-time jobs to afford their tuition. Mike would often brag about how his maid would do whatever he wanted, imitating Dorothy's accent to make his friends laugh. What Mike didn't see was how Dorothy spent her day. How she meticulously cleaned every room in the massive house, prepared elaborate meals, handled the laundry, and managed the household schedule. She knew every detail of their lives, Mr. Preston's allergies, Mrs. Preston's precise preferences for how her clothes should be pressed, Mike's favorite snacks. She remembered their birthdays, their anniversaries, their important meetings and events. During her lunch break, which she took in the small staff room off the kitchen, Dorothy would video call her children. They'd grown up seeing their mother only in the evenings and on her one day off. But she'd made those moments count, teaching them the value of hard work, education, and treating everyone with respect regardless of their position in life. As afternoon approached, Mike returned from school, tossing his expensive backpack onto the floor for Dorothy to pick up. He had just received news of his early acceptance into an elite university, not because of his grades, which were mediocre, but because of his father's generous donation to the school. "Hey, we're having a party to celebrate my college acceptance," he announced to Dorothy as she prepared his afternoon snack. "Make sure you don't embarrass us like you did at the last one." Dorothy nodded quietly, remembering the last party where one of Mike's friends had deliberately tripped her while she was serving drinks, and how the teenagers had laughed while she cleaned up the mess. Still, she continued her work with grace, her silent resilience a stark contrast to the loud, entitled behavior of the household's youngest member. The day wound down with Dorothy preparing dinner for the Andersons' visit. She'd been cooking since afternoon, making sure every dish was perfect. As she worked, she could hear Mike in the living room, bragging to his online gaming friends about his acceptance letter, making crude jokes about the scholarship students who actually had to study to get in. What Mike didn't realize was that Dorothy's own children had earned their way into prestigious universities through hard work and determination. They'd studied late into the night after their part-time jobs, written countless scholarship essays, and maintained perfect grades. But Dorothy never mentioned this, not because she wasn't proud, but because no one in the Preston household had ever asked. As evening approached and Dorothy prepared to leave for the day, she quietly gathered her things in the staff room. She looked at a photo of her family tucked into her purse, her children at their graduation ceremonies, beaming with pride. Then she straightened her uniform, held her head high, and walked through the mansion one last time, checking that everything was perfect for the dinner party. Mike barely noticed as Dorothy said goodbye for the day. He was too busy deciding what to wear to impress the Andersons' daughter. He didn't see Dorothy waiting at the bus stop in the growing dark, didn't know about her long journey home, didn't understand that while his day was ending in luxury, hers would continue with evening classes as she worked toward her own dreams. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been starker. Mike's world of endless privilege and Dorothy's life of quiet determination. But change was coming, though neither of them knew it yet. The carefully maintained balance of the Preston household was about to shift, and Mike's comfortable world was about to be turned upside down in ways he never could have imagined. The Preston mansion buzzed with excitement as caterers and event staff transformed the already elegant home into something even more spectacular. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the scent of gourmet hors d'oeuvres filled the air. This wasn't just any party. It was Mike's celebration for getting into an elite university, and his parents had spared no expense. Dorothy had been working since dawn, making sure everything was perfect. She polished every surface until it gleamed, arranged fresh flowers throughout the house, and helped coordinate with the catering staff. Her feet ached from hours of standing, but she kept going, knowing how important this event was to the family. "Make sure you wear the new uniform I bought for special events," Mrs. Preston instructed Dorothy, barely looking up from her phone. "And remember, some very important people will be here tonight. Everything must be perfect." The new uniform was stiff and uncomfortable, a stark white that made Dorothy feel like she stood out even more. But she nodded quietly and went to change, just as she'd done countless times before. Through the years, she'd learned that invisibility was often her best defense in this household. As evening approached, guests began arriving in expensive cars, wearing designer outfits that cost more than Dorothy's monthly salary. Business tycoons, local politicians, and elite society members filled the Prestons' massive living room. Their teenage children, all from the same privileged circle as Mike, clustered together, their laughter echoing through the halls. Mike strutted around in his new designer suit, basking in the attention. "Yeah, I mean, the acceptance was pretty much guaranteed," he bragged to his friends, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Dad made sure of that. He laughed, sipping from a champagne glass that Dorothy knew he was too young to have. The party was in full swing when it happened. Dorothy was carrying a tray of champagne glasses through the crowded room. She'd done this hundreds of times before, weaving carefully between guests, but this time was different. As she passed by Mike's group, she didn't notice his foot supplely stick out. Time seemed to slow down as Dorothy tripped. The crystal glasses flew from her tray, shattering against the marble floor with a crash that seemed to silence the entire party. Champagne splashed onto several guests, including Mike's expensive new shoes. "Are you kidding me?" Mike's voice cut through the sudden silence. "Look what you did to my new shoes. These cost more than you make in a month." Dorothy quickly got to her knees, trying to clean up the mess with trembling hands. But Mike wasn't done. The combination of alcohol, showing off for his friends, and years of unchecked privilege erupted into something ugly. "I bet you did this on purpose," he sneered, his voice getting louder. "Jealous that your kids could never get into a school like this without cleaning the toilets." His friends snickered, phones raised to record the scene. Dorothy kept her eyes down, focused on picking up the broken glass. Her hands were shaking, but she maintained her dignity, just as she had through countless smaller humiliations over the years. "Hey everyone," Mike called out, drawing more attention to the scene. "Want to hear how she talks when she thinks no one's listening?" He proceeded to do a cruel imitation of Dorothy's accent, encouraging his friends to join in. The room had split into distinct reactions. Some guests looked away uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. Others watched with morbid fascination. A few older guests frowned disapprovingly, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Mrs. Preston was too busy trying to salvage the party's atmosphere to notice her son's behavior, while Mr. Preston was absorbed in a business conversation on the other side of the room. One of Mike's friends chimed in, "Maybe she's just mad she has to serve at parties instead of attending them." This got another round of cruel laughter from their group. Through it all, Dorothy maintained her composure, though a few tears escaped despite her best efforts. She'd spent years building a life of dignity, putting her children through school, taking business classes at night. Now, in front of hundreds of influential people, she was being humiliated by a teenager who had never worked a day in his life. "Mr. Michael," she finally said quietly, still cleaning up the mess, "I think you've had too much to drink." This attempt to help him save face only made him angrier. "Don't you dare tell me what I've had. You're just the help. Remember your place." The phones recording the scene captured every word, every cruel laugh, every moment of Dorothy's quiet dignity in the face of such treatment. What no one knew then was that these videos would soon find their way online, spreading far beyond the privileged bubble of their social circle. As Dorothy finally finished cleaning up the mess, one of the catering staff helped her to her feet. She quietly excused herself to the kitchen, maintaining her professional demeanor until she was out of sight. Only then, in the privacy of the staff area, did she allow herself to break down for a moment. But she couldn't stay there long. There was still work to be done, guests to serve, appearances to maintain. She dried her eyes, straightened her uniform, and prepared to return to the party. As she did, she thought of her children, of all the sacrifices she'd made to give them a better life, of the strength she'd shown in the face of prejudice and disrespect over the years. Meanwhile, Mike had already moved on, bragging about his upcoming semester abroad, completely unaware that his actions that night would soon come back to haunt him. He couldn't know that among the party guests were people who would remember this incident when his name crossed their desk in the future, or that the videos his friends were sharing would soon reach far beyond their intended audience. The party continued into the night, with Dorothy maintaining her professional composure despite the whispers and glances that followed her. She served drinks, cleared plates, and managed the staff with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown for years. But something had changed. The carefully maintained facade of civility in the Preston household had cracked, revealing the ugly truth beneath the surface. As the last guests departed and Dorothy prepared to head home, she didn't know that this humiliating evening would become a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire Preston family. The videos were already being shared, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The reckoning was coming, though none of them could see it yet. By Monday morning, the videos from the party had spread far beyond the wealthy bubble of Boston's elite society. What started as a few social media posts quickly turned into a viral storm. The clips showed everything: Mike's cruel taunts, his racist implications, and Dorothy's quiet dignity as she cleaned up the mess while being mocked. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mike woke up to hundreds of notifications on his phone. His social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from strangers. People were sharing the videos with hashtags like #PrivilegeGoneWrong and #JusticeForDorothy. His friends, who had laughed along with him that night, were now quietly distancing themselves, deleting their own social media posts from the party. At breakfast, the usual peaceful morning routine was shattered by the sound of Mr. Preston shouting into his phone in his home office. The family's PR team was already scrambling to contain the situation, but the damage was spreading. Local news stations had picked up the story, and journalists were parked outside their gates, hoping to catch a comment from the family. "This is a disaster." Mrs. Preston paced the kitchen, her usually perfectly composed face showing signs of stress. "The charity board is already calling emergency meetings. Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" Mike rolled his eyes, still not grasping the severity of the situation. "It's not that big a deal. She's just a maid." But it was a big deal. By lunchtime, the video had been viewed millions of times. Social media users had dug up everything they could find about the Preston family, their business connections, their social circle, their history of donations to the university Mike was supposed to attend. Dorothy didn't come to work that day, or the next. Her phone was filled with messages of support from people she'd never met, including reporters wanting to tell her story. Her son, a successful lawyer, had seen the video and was already taking action. He'd spent years building his reputation fighting for civil rights, and now his mother's humiliation had become a symbol of everything he fought against. The university's response came swiftly and publicly. A formal letter arrived at the Preston house, stating that after careful review of recent events that conflict with our institution's values, they were rescinding Mike's acceptance. The donation his father had made to secure his spot couldn't save him from the consequences of his own actions. "This is ridiculous," Mike shouted, throwing the letter across the room. "Dad, can't you fix this?" But Mr. Preston was facing his own crisis. Business partners were quietly backing away from deals. The investment firm's stock price was dropping as clients questioned whether they wanted to be associated with the viral video's family. Decades of carefully cultivated business relationships were unraveling over a few minutes of recorded cruelty. Mrs. Preston's social circle, once a source of status and influence, began to crumble. The charity organizations she chaired suddenly found reasons to restructure their boards. Friends canceled lunch plans. The same people who had attended their party just days ago were now publicly condemning their family's behavior. The Preston household fell into chaos without Dorothy. Mrs. Preston had no idea how to operate the washing machine. The kitchen, usually spotless and well organized, became a mess of takeout containers because no one knew how to cook. The pristine mansion began to show signs of neglect without Dorothy's careful maintenance. Local community leaders organized a protest outside the Preston's gated community. They carried signs supporting Dorothy and condemning the family's behavior. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage of the growing crowd. The same gates that had kept the outside world at bay now felt like prison walls, trapping the family inside their own fortress of privilege. Mike's private school called an assembly to address the incident, though he wasn't there to hear it. He'd stopped attending classes, tired of the whispers and stares from classmates who used to compete for his attention. Even his closest friends wouldn't answer his texts anymore. The family's lawyer advised them to make a public apology, but it backfired spectacularly. Mr. Preston's carefully worded statement about regrettable actions and learning opportunities came across as insincere. People were quick to point out that he was more concerned about protecting his family's reputation than acknowledging the real harm done to Dorothy. Dorothy's story, meanwhile, resonated with people across the country. Social media users uncovered that she'd been putting herself through business school while working multiple jobs. A crowdfunding campaign started by supporters raised enough money for her to finally start her own cleaning business, something she'd been dreaming of for years. 1 month after the incident, the Prestons' perfectly curated world had completely unraveled. Their social status, built on generations of wealth and influence, couldn't protect them from the consequences of their actions being exposed to the world. The family that had once looked down on Dorothy now found themselves isolated, their privilege providing no shelter from public accountability. The hardest part for Mike wasn't the lost university acceptance or the social isolation. It was the realization that he had no real skills to fall back on. Everything in his life had been handed to him, and now, faced with actual consequences for the first time, he had no idea how to handle them. The media coverage eventually died down, but the impact lingered. The Preston family's name, once associated with wealth and influence, became a cautionary tale about privilege and accountability in the digital age. Their story was discussed in university classes, featured in documentaries, and became a reference point in conversations about social justice and wealth inequality. As autumn approached and Mike's former classmates left for college, he remained at home, watching his carefully planned future crumble. What he didn't know was that this fall from privilege would become the catalyst for profound personal change, though the path to redemption would be longer and harder than anything he'd ever faced before. The late summer heat was stifling as Mike walked down the busy street, clutching a stack of printed resumes in his sweaty hands. 3 months had passed since the party incident, and his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. His father had finally put his foot down, cutting off his allowance and demanding that he find a job. "No son of mine is going to sit around feeling sorry for himself," Mr. Preston had declared. "If you're not going to college, you're going to work." The irony wasn't lost on Mike that he was now applying for the kind of jobs he'd spent years looking down on. His designer clothes and expensive watch felt out of place as he pushed open the door of Joe's Diner, a modest restaurant in a working-class neighborhood far from his family's mansion. The kitchen was hot and noisy, filled with the clatter of dishes and sizzling grills. The owner, a gruff man with calloused hands and tired eyes, barely glanced at Mike's perfectly formatted resume. "Ever worked in a kitchen before?" he asked. "No, but I'm willing to learn," Mike replied, trying to sound confident despite his nervousness. "Dishwasher position, $12 an hour. Start tonight if you want it." And just like that, Mike Preston I&I, who once bragged about his $900 sneakers, found himself wearing non-slip work shoes and an apron, standing in front of an industrial sink full of dirty dishes. The first night was a shock to his system. The water was too hot, the dishes seemed endless, and his back ached from standing. His soft hands, unused to real work, developed blisters. By closing time, he was soaked in sweat and smelled like old food. "First night's always the hardest," said Chen, the elderly cook who'd been working at Joe's for 20 years. "Tomorrow will be better." But tomorrow wasn't better. Neither was the day after that. Mike's muscles screamed in protest each morning as he dragged himself out of bed. His fingers cracked from the constant exposure to hot water and harsh cleaning chemicals. The other kitchen staff spoke rapidly in a mix of languages he didn't understand, and he felt completely out of place. The worst part was realizing that most of his coworkers worked multiple jobs. The morning prep cook rushed off to clean offices in the afternoon. The waitress who helped him stack dishes also worked nights at a convenience store. They weren't doing this for extra spending money. They were supporting families, paying for their children's education, keeping roofs over their heads. One evening, during a rare quiet moment, Mike overheard 2 servers talking about their college classes. They were taking night courses at community college, working full-time to pay for their education. He thought about how he'd thrown away his university acceptance, how he'd mocked people who had to actually work to get an education. "Hey, rich boy," called out Ray, another dishwasher, interrupting Mike's thoughts. "Those plates aren't going to wash themselves." At first, the nickname had stung, but Mike was slowly earning respect through his willingness to work hard. He'd stopped wearing his expensive watch after it got water damaged, and his designer clothes had been replaced by practical workwear. His hands were developing calluses, and he was learning to take pride in a well-organized dish pit. The biggest change came from the conversations during smoke breaks. Though Mike didn't smoke, he started joining these breaks just to rest his feet. He listened as his coworkers talked about their lives, their struggles with rent increases, their pride in their children's achievements, their dreams for the future. Mrs. Lee, the tiny woman who ran the prep station with military precision, had a daughter in medical school. "Every vegetable I chop, every sauce I make, it's for her future," she told Mike one day. "There's no shame in honest work." These words hit Mike hard, remembering how he'd mocked Dorothy for being just a maid. He thought about all the meals she'd prepared for his family, all the care she'd put into maintaining their home, and how he'd never once shown her real gratitude. The diner's customers were another eye-opener. Construction workers still dusty from their jobs, nurses stopping in after long shifts, students stretching their dollars with the daily special, Mike served them all. He learned that a kind word or a clean table could brighten someone's tough day, that there was dignity in every job well done. 1 month into his job, Mike experienced something he'd never felt before: the satisfaction of earning his own money. His first paycheck was smaller than any monthly allowance he'd ever received, but somehow it meant more. He understood now why Chen beamed with pride when talking about putting his grandchildren through college with his cook's salary. The Preston mansion felt different when he returned home each night, exhausted but somehow more alive than he'd ever been. He noticed things he'd never seen before: the careful arrangement of fresh flowers Dorothy used to maintain, the spotless surfaces she'd spent hours polishing, the organized chaos of running a household that she'd managed single-handedly. His mother still struggled with basic household tasks, and the house had lost its pristine shine. Sometimes Mike would find himself automatically wiping down counters or organizing dishes, habits he picked up from work. His parents watched this transformation with a mixture of confusion and surprise. "You've changed," his father remarked one evening, watching Mike methodically clean the kitchen after making his own dinner. "Yeah," Mike replied, thinking about Mrs. Lee's words about honest work. "I guess I needed to." The designer clothes in his closet gathered dust, and his social media accounts remained dormant. The world of privilege he'd once inhabited seemed increasingly distant and artificial. Instead, his days were filled with real people, real work, and real lessons about life that no expensive private school had ever taught him. Winter had settled over the city, and steam rose from the hot dishes as Mike worked his usual evening shift at Joe's Diner. 4 months into his job, he'd developed a rhythm to his work, finding satisfaction in the simple routine of keeping the kitchen running smoothly. But it was his growing friendship with Mr. Thomas, the night cook, that would change his perspective forever. Mr. Thomas was in his 60s, with gray hair and hands marked by decades of kitchen work. He'd been quiet around Mike at first, keeping his distance from the rich kid everyone talked about. But over time, as Mike proved himself through hard work, Mr. Thomas began to open up. One slow evening, as they cleaned the kitchen together, Mr. Thomas shared his story. "You remind me of my own wake-up call," he said, wiping down the grill. "I used to think I had all the answers too." Mr. Thomas had grown up in a middle-class family, never questioning his own prejudices until life forced him to. He'd lost everything in the economic crash of '08, his restaurant, his savings, his home. "Sometimes life has to humble you before it can teach you," he said, his voice carrying years of hard-earned wisdom. The conversation shifted to Dorothy, and Mike felt the familiar shame rising in his chest. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," he admitted, scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot. "I never even knew her first name until it was in the news." "That's the thing about privilege," Mr. Thomas replied, not unkindly. "It can blind you to the humanity in others, but it's never too late to open your eyes." Through their evening talks, Mike learned about the reality of working people's lives, not through statistics or news articles, but through real stories. He learned about Mr. Thomas's daughter, who worked as a nurse while raising 2 kids on her own. He'd heard about the sacrifices parents made to give their children better opportunities, just like Dorothy had done. "You know what the hardest part is?" Mr. Thomas asked one night. "It's not the long hours or the aching feet. It's being invisible. People look right through you when they think you're beneath them." These words hit Mike like a physical blow. How many times had he looked right through Dorothy? How many times had he treated her as part of the furniture rather than a human being with hopes, dreams, and dignity? The diner became Mike's classroom, teaching him lessons no expensive private school ever could. He learned about resilience from Mrs. Lee, who never missed a shift despite chronic pain. He learned about community from Ray, who organized food donations for co-workers going through tough times. He learned about dignity from Chen, who took pride in every dish that left his station. One snowy evening, a well-dressed couple came into the diner. They reminded Mike of his parents' friends, and he noticed how they barely looked at the staff, speaking as if the workers weren't even there. He saw himself in their behavior, and it made him uncomfortable. "That used to be me," he told Mr. Thomas later that night. "I thought money made me better than everyone else." "And now?" Mr. Thomas asked, raising an eyebrow. "No, I know it just made me blind," Mike replied, continuing to wash dishes with hands that no longer felt the sting of hot water. The lessons came in small moments, like when he saw Mrs. Lee counting quarters for bus fare and remembered how he'd once spent more on a single pair of socks than she made in a day. Or when Chan proudly showed photos of his grandchildren's graduation, reminding Mike of how he'd mocked Dorothy for putting her children through college. Life at home had changed too. Mike's parents noticed the difference in their son. He no longer demanded things be done for him, but pitched in with household chores. He'd learned to cook simple meals, do his own laundry, and clean up after himself, skills he'd never needed when Dorothy was there. One evening, Mike found his old phone with the video from that terrible party night. He watched it again, but this time through different eyes. He saw not just his cruel words, but the humanity in Dorothy's quiet dignity. He saw not his privilege, but his ignorance. "Working changes you," Mr. Thomas observed one night, watching Mike carefully organize the cleaning supplies, something the old Mike would never have done. "It teaches you the value of things. Not just money, but people, time, effort." The diner's regular customers began to notice the change in Mike too. The morning rush of construction workers, who'd initially viewed him with suspicion, now greeted him by name. The elderly couple who came in every Wednesday for the meatloaf special would save him their newspaper's crossword puzzle. During his breaks, Mike would sit in the back alley with his coworkers, sharing stories and meals. The conversations were different from his old social circle. Instead of bragging about vacations and purchases, they talked about their hopes for their children, their struggles with bills, their small victories and daily challenges. "You're not the same person who walked in here months ago," Mr. Thomas told him one evening. "That kid wouldn't have lasted a week." Mike thought about this as he cleaned the kitchen that night. He thought about Dorothy, about dignity, about the meaning of work. He thought about all the people he'd looked down on, never realizing they were the ones who could teach him the most valuable lessons. The path to understanding wasn't easy. Every day brought new realizations about his past behavior, new moments of shame, but also new opportunities to be better. Through honest work and genuine connections, Mike was slowly learning what his privilege had prevented him from seeing: the fundamental dignity and worth in every person, regardless of their job or status. Spring had arrived in the city, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Mike felt deep in his soul. After 6 months of working at Joe's Diner, he'd learned more about life, respect, and dignity than he had in all his previous years combined. But there was still one thing weighing heavily on his conscience. He needed to make things right with Dorothy. Finding her wasn't easy. The viral video had led to opportunities for Dorothy, and she used the crowdfunding money to start her own cleaning business. Through Mr. Thomas's daughter, who worked at the same hospital as Dorothy's son, Mike was able to get a message to her, requesting a meeting. The response came 3 days later. Dorothy would meet him, but on her terms, at her office during business hours. The address she provided was in a modest but well-maintained office building, nothing like the luxury high-rises Mike had grown up around. The sign on the door read Williams Professional Cleaning Services. Mike arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the same clothes he wore to work at the diner. His designer wardrobe felt like it belonged to a different person now. His hands, once soft and pampered, were rough from months of dishwashing, and he felt proud of these calluses. They were proof of his transformation. The waiting room was simple but spotless, with comfortable chairs and professional certificates hanging on the walls. Among them was Dorothy's recently completed business degree, something Mike had never known she was pursuing during all those years she worked for his family. When Dorothy's assistant showed him into her office, Mike barely recognized her. Gone was the uniform she'd worn for so many years. Instead, she sat behind a desk in a professional business suit, looking confident and composed. Several employees could be seen working in the outer office, and a stack of contracts sat on her desk. "Hello, Mr. Michael," she said, her voice calm but careful. "Please have a seat." Mike's carefully prepared speech disappeared from his mind. Sitting across from Dorothy, seeing her in this new light, he felt the full weight of his past behavior. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for everything." Dorothy watched him silently, her expression neutral. Mike took a deep breath and continued, "I know saying sorry isn't enough. What I did, how I treated you, there's no excuse for it. He told her about his job at the diner, about learning the value of hard work, about understanding what it meant to be treated as invisible. "Mr. Thomas, he's the night cook. He helped me see things differently. But I should have learned these lessons from you during all those years you took care of our family." Dorothy's expression softened slightly. "Go on," she said. Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is my first 6 months of savings from working at the diner. I know it's not much compared to what you went through, but I want to donate it to your business's scholarship fund for employees' children." Dorothy opened the envelope, looking at the modest sum inside, far less than Mike used to spend on a single shopping trip, but representing countless hours of honest work. "I heard about your children," Mike continued. "How they went to college, how successful they are. You did that while working for us, while dealing with our disrespect. I never saw your strength before, but I see it now." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she shared something that made Mike's heart ache. "Every morning for 12 years, I woke up at 4 a.m. to take 2 buses to your house. I worked 3 jobs to put my children through school. I took night classes to earn my degree. And not once, did anyone in your family ask about my life." Mike felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I was blind," he admitted. "Privilege made me blind." "Yes, it did," Dorothy agreed. "But you're seeing now, aren't you?" She told him about her new business, how she employed single mothers and paid for their training, how she was creating opportunities for others like herself. The viral video, as painful as it was, had become a catalyst for positive change in her life. "Your actions that night were cruel," she said firmly. "But sometimes pain leads to growth. I can see you're not the same person you were." Mike nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "I have a proposal for you," Dorothy continued, surprising him. "Our company is starting a mentorship program for at-risk youth, teaching them about business and responsibility. Would you be willing to share your story? About privilege, consequences, and change?" Mike looked up, shocked. "You trust me with that?" "The best teachers are often those who've learned the hardest lessons," Dorothy replied. "Your story could help others understand the impact of their actions." They talked for another hour, not as former maid and employer's son, but as 2 human beings. Dorothy shared stories about her children's achievements, her dreams for her company's future, and her hope that society could change, one person at a time. As their meeting drew to a close, Dorothy said something that would stay with Mike forever. "True change isn't just feeling sorry for past actions. It's about using what you've learned to make a difference moving forward." Mike left Dorothy's office that day with a new purpose. The journey wasn't over, it was really just beginning. But for the first time, he felt worthy of the second chance he'd been given. He had one more shift at the diner that evening, and somehow, the dishes seemed lighter than before. 2 years had passed since that life-changing party night. The morning sun streamed through the windows of a community center classroom where Mike stood before a group of high school students. His hands, still bearing the calluses from his ongoing work at Joe's Diner, gripped the podium lightly as he shared his story. 2 years ago, I was the worst kind of person," he began, his voice steady. "I had everything handed to me, and I looked down on people who worked hard for what they had. I thought money made me better than everyone else. I was wrong." The students listened intently as Mike described his journey. He still worked part-time at the diner, now managing the evening shift while taking classes at the local community college. His study of social work had become his passion, fueled by his experiences and transformation. "The best education I ever got wasn't from my expensive private school," he told them. "It was from the people I once looked down on, the dishwashers, cooks, and cleaners who taught me about dignity, hard work, and respect." After his meeting with Dorothy, Mike had thrown himself into her company's mentorship program. Twice a week, he worked with young people from privileged backgrounds, helping them understand the impact of their actions and attitudes. His own story became a powerful tool for change. "You know what's funny?" he said to the students. "I used to think I was better than Dorothy because she cleaned houses for a living. Now her company employs 50 people, provides benefits and education support, and she's speaking at business conferences. She built all that while dealing with people like who I used to be." The changes in Mike's life went far beyond his work and education. His relationship with his parents had evolved too. His father, impressed by his son's transformation, had started a scholarship program at his company for employees' children. His mother volunteered at a local women's shelter, finally understanding the value of direct community involvement rather than just writing checks for charity galas. During his breaks at the diner, Mike would sometimes sit with Mr. Thomas, sharing updates about the mentorship program. "You know what the hardest part is?" he told his old friend. "Getting them to see what I couldn't see, that every person has value, regardless of their job or bank account." Dorothy's business had become a model for ethical employment practices. She'd been featured in business magazines and local news, not for the viral video anymore, but for her innovative approach to creating opportunities for others. Mike kept a copy of one such article pinned up in the diner's break room. "The video that ruined my old life." Mike continued with his presentation. "It's now part of training programs about workplace respect and dignity. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the best teachers." His own apartment, a modest one-bedroom he paid for with his diner wages and part-time social work internship, was a far cry from his childhood mansion. But every item in it had been earned through his own work, and that made it more valuable than all his former luxuries combined. The students asked questions after his talk. One wealthy teenager reminded Mike of his younger self, asked if he regretted losing his privileged lifestyle. "I didn't lose privilege," Mike responded thoughtfully. "I gained perspective. I learned that real respect isn't about what you have, it's about how you treat people." He still worked the occasional dish shift at Joe's, despite not needing to anymore. "It keeps me grounded," he explained to anyone who asked. The hot water and endless dishes were reminders of where his journey of transformation began. The diner had become more than a workplace, it was a second home. The staff, once skeptical of the rich kid, were now family. They celebrated birthdays together, supported each other through hard times, and shared in each other's successes. Mike's old social media accounts remained dormant, replaced by meaningful real-world connections. The designer clothes that once filled his closet had been donated, replaced by simple, practical items. His former friends, who had distanced themselves after the video went viral, occasionally reached out, surprised by his transformation. "The amazing thing about change," he told the students as his presentation drew to a close, "is that it spreads. Every person who learns to see others with respect and dignity creates a ripple effect." After his talks, Mike would often return to the diner for his evening shift, wearing his non-slick shoes and apron with pride. Regular customers who knew his story would sometimes bring their own children in, pointing out that success isn't about having money, it's about having character. Dorothy's company had grown to include a foundation that provided scholarships for employee education. Mike served on its youth advisory board, helping to create programs that bridged the gap between privileged and working-class communities. "You know what Dorothy taught me?" he shared with a student who stayed after the presentation to talk. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about creating a better future. Every day, I try to be worthy of the second chance I was given." As Mike ended his presentation that day, he looked out at the young faces in the audience. Some were from wealthy families, others from working-class backgrounds, but all were listening. Real change, he had learned, starts with understanding each other's humanity. "My story isn't special," he concluded. "What's special is what we choose to do after we learn our lessons. Every day is a chance to be better, to see people more clearly, to create positive change. The question is, what will you do with that chance?"